Jefferson pays them both while they're over there. It's also in Paris that Madison Hemings says, Sally Hemings' son, says that Jefferson and Hemings began a relationship. And at the end of their stay, when he wants to come back to America, she doesn't want to come because she's pregnant. And she understood that under the laws of Virginia, any child she had would be a slave. When the American, when they weren't American, when the colonists came to America, they came with the English rule that you were what your father was. That was the standard rule. And once the slave system started to get going, they switched it to you are what your mother is. And you can think about what a difference that makes for slavery. I mean, men can have more children than women. The sexuality of men is not as controlled, was not kept as under tight control as the sexuality of women. And you would have a large class of mixed race free people. So switching it to the Roman rule, they said, we're not English anymore. That was the Roman rule, partus sequitur ventrum, birth follows the stomach, but it really means birth follows the womb, altered the nature of slavery and made it a much more efficient and a viable system. She knew this, and Jefferson promised her that if she came back to America, she would have a good life, and her children would be free when they were adults. They would live with her as children, and then when they got to be 21, they would leave. So she accepts that. Some people could say she buys that, but she accepts that. That would be a pejorative term. She accepts that, but she's 16 years old. Now, 16, interesting writing this book because at the time that I was doing this, I had a daughter who was 16. And 16-year-olds today are not the same thing as 16-year-olds in the 18th century. We've sort of prolonged childhood now until about 30. You know, so it's true. We still see her as very, very young, but, you know, Jefferson's mother was married when she was, 17, and his daughter was married when she was 17. It's not the same, but still, think of a 16-year-old with her brother who is 24. And I don't believe, and I say in the book, I don't think this was just a plan that she hatched. He hires the tutor to teach him proper grammar at the end of his stay. So that's not like somebody who's saying, I'm going back to Virginia. But nevertheless, they come back, and that's the end of the second section. And the third section is called On the Mountain. And in that, I introduce other members of the Hemings family to talk about them. John Hemings, if you've ever been to Monticello, he is the master carpenter. He was the master carpenter at Monticello, another one of Sally Hemings' brothers. Some of his handiwork is on display at Monticello there today if you go and visit. I talk about his life. I talk about the sort of emerging scandal in 1802 when James Callender first prints the story about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and for a time makes her probably the most famous enslaved person in the 18th and in the 19th century. I mean, Douglass is famous, but Douglass becomes famous after he's freed, after he gets his freedom. Here's a person who's enslaved, who's been written about in newspapers in Boston and in Richmond and some in London and other places. Everybody knows who Sally is. If you were to say Thomas Jefferson in the early 1800s and you said Sally, everybody would know what you were talking about. There's a letter that a person writes, and he is telling his friend that he's just come back from Mount Sally. That was his nickname for Monticello. So this is this well-known person, but who is, under law, the equivalent of a chattel. But she enters the presidential race when Jefferson is about to be, James Callender prints this in 1802, hoping to end Jefferson's presidency. But nevertheless, he is resoundingly reelected in 1804, brings a lot of people in Congress along with him. The public didn't care. Either they didn't believe it or they didn't care. He bought Louisiana. Everybody wants to go west. Who cared? No, people didn't care. This is one of the sort of recurring theme in American politics where people tried to use the sexual lives of politicians to convince Americans not to vote for them. And it never works. If there are other issues that people are concerned about, namely, I want to go west, and he got the west for us. He's double the size of the United States. I don't care if he has a slave mistress. So in any event, he's resoundingly reelected. The story dies down for most of the rest of his life. It kind of bubbles up occasionally when people who hate Jefferson want to say something nasty about him. They bring up, you know, Sally Hemings and the Sable Mistress, the African Venus, all these various things that they call her. I also talk about the children of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. One of the things that was interesting to me, in my first book, I'd seen some letters from Jefferson to his overseer, in which he writes, his overseer at Poplar Forest, which was his retreat. I mean, Monticello's in the country, but Poplar Forest is even more in the country. After he retired, hordes of people sort of descended on Monticello to pay homage to him, but they really wanted to be there to stay for weeks at a time and eat up all of his food and have him pay for the horse, feed the horses and everything. So in sort of Jefferson passive-aggressive fashion, what he does is he doesn't say, get out of my house. He just builds another house and moves and goes out to Poplar Forest a lot of times. Well, he sends these letters to his overseers, and he says, you know, I'm coming to Poplar Forest with Johnny Hemings and his 2 assistants. And depending upon what year, those 2 assistants are either Beverly Hemings and Madison Hemings, or Madison Hemings and Eston Hemings, which are the sons with Sally Hemings. He put these 3 young men, these boys, under the apprenticeship of their uncle to teach them how to become carpenters. And so Jefferson himself was a woodworker and loved to work, liked to make furniture and things of that nature. So looking at these letters, I realized he is spending lots of time with them out in Poplar Forest, which is, like I said, the middle of nowhere, in a very, very small place, much smaller place than Monticello. So it gave me a different sense of how his sort of connections to these children. They're not really, he's not distant from them. He's spending actually a lot of time with them. The book ends with the final calamity at Monticello. Jefferson dies in 1826, $107,000 in debt. $107,000 in 1826 would be millions of dollars. And, you know, people say, well, it was all the profligate living. Well, it was profligate living, not inattention to business details, but also all these hordes of people that I told you about. I mean, I'm not talking like 2 or 3 people. I'm talking about dozens of people who show up with whole families, horses, everybody in tow. He also, in 1819, co-signed 2 notes for his grandson's father-in-law. And he defaulted on those notes, and Jefferson became liable for something like $40,000 in a short order. And that, he might have been able to make it, but for the co-signing those notes, but that really finished him off. So 1826, he hasn't got out from underwater by 1826, and he dies bankrupt. And so that institutes the final calamity for not just his family, not his legal white family, but for the slaves on the plantation, because they're not just losing property, possessions, they're losing family members, because they are put up to auction. 130 people were put up to auction, and many of them scattered to the 4 winds, and probably never saw their relatives ever again. Sally Hemings and her sons move into Charlottesville and live there until her death. The 2 oldest children, Beverly and Harriet, Beverly being a male, left Monticello as white people. And we don't know what happened to them, because they changed their racial identity, probably changed their names. I'm going to be doing another volume of the story about the family, and I want to try, it's like a needle in the haystack, but it would be interesting to try to see if I could figure out what happened with them. So the Hemings-Whale siblings that I talked to you about before, the ones who survive, they end up free somehow when Jefferson dies. It's really the sort of collateral relatives who begin to suffer. I end the book with the story of Joe Fawcett, who is a grandson of Sally Hemings. He was the blacksmith at Monticello. Jefferson freed him in his will, but he did not free his wife or Fawcett's children. So Fawcett's children are sold at auction,